Welcome everyone to your Nativism and Chinese in America lecture. I'm going to be discussing Nativism as it pertains to Chinese in America. We will be discussing more about Nativism throughout this course because Nativism is embedded into American history. Your objectives are: I want you to understand Nativism and Americans' views of Chinese in America during the mid to late 1800s, and I want you to understand Chinese plight in America during the mid to late 1800s. I have a couple of assignments for you regarding Nativism and Chinese in America. One is a primary source discussion analysis, and the other is a film reflection. So I want you to take this lecture into consideration when you are doing your assignments. All right, so what is nativism? Nativism is an anti-foreign sentiment. It's opposition to free and unrestricted immigration. And a group of people that were a particular target of nativism in the mid to late 1800s was Chinese. Chinese first came to America in the 1850s during the gold rush. They came because of poverty and political upheaval. They ran restaurants and laundries. They had businesses, and they were farmers, and they were also railroad workers. During the late 1800s, America experienced an economic depression. Because of this, there will be a lot of hostility and violence toward Chinese. Americans' views of Chinese in the mid to late 1800s was that they didn't fit into the American ideal. What I mean by that is they weren't white, Anglo-Saxon Christians. They had a different culture, they looked different, they dressed differently, they had different types of food, and they were also not coming to America in families. They were often coming over as single young men. They would work here, they would send money home, and then they would leave, at least at first. Those group of people were called sojourners. So they feel like these people, that Chinese were too transit to be Americans. That they weren't understanding American values and the ideas of American family. But over time, Chinese would start to stay and live here for long periods of time. But the most prominent issue for Americans during the economic depression was that they were taking American jobs. At least that's the way they viewed it. That they couldn't find work, they couldn't feed their families, and it was Chinese fault that was happening. So how they responded to this was they perpetrated violence, such as in the Rock Springs Massacre, which is one of your sources that I gave you for analysis. And they also implemented legislation and ordinances, both federal and state legislation, as well as local ordinances. Two of those ordinances were the Laundry Ordinance and the Q Ordinance. The Laundry Ordinance said that you had to pay a particular amount of money if you used a horse-drawn transportation or vehicle to transport laundry, which particularly targeted Chinese. The Q ordinance said that you had to cut your hair within an inch. Qs, for lack of a better term, were ponytails that many Chinese wore. And this was a symbol of their class structure in China. So they had to wear the Q to represent that culture in China. So If you cut the queue, that meant you couldn't come home because you would be punished for not wearing the queue. And then they had the big legislation, which was Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Chinese Exclusion Act barred Chinese from immigration. And this is significant because it created a legal foundation for creating exclusionary immigrant policies. So, in other words, this is the first time that the U.S. will ban immigration based on a particular ethnicity. And they will do this later on as well, but in the 1800s, they started doing this. So how does Chinese respond to the American legislation policies? For one, that they sue. That's kind of really the main thing that they do. There was a case called the Hoa Noa versus Noonan in 1879. It was a federal court case. And the court case arose out of an incident where Chinese were violating or were thought to be violating the 500 cubic feet ordinance. What it meant was that a certain amount of people certain amount of single people in particular, could not live in a space over more than 500 cubic feet, and which particularly targeted Chinese because oftentimes, particularly those that were coming over as single men, and they would often live in a house together. So this was clearly targeting Chinese. So they were fined for it. They didn't pay their fine. They ended up going to jail. Hoa Cao ended up going to jail. While he's there, the sheriff ends up cutting his queue. So in the end, they sue. Noonan is the sheriff. So ultimately, they sue and they win. And what the U.S. What the courts say is that they violated, that this ordinance, this 500 cubic feet ordinance, was a violation of the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And it also establishes that the Equal Protection Law was for all people, not just U.S. citizens. All right, so that ends your lecture.